Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a seriously fascinating mystery to unravel today. It's this giant puzzle that has honestly perplexed political scientists for decades, and it sits right dead center at the intersection of power, gender, and the unwritten rules of society. We're going to be diving into a groundbreaking study by Daniel Zizumbo Kalunga and Maria del Pilar Fuertes Celis, and let me tell you, it completely flips how we understand the lack of women in political leadership. When I first read through this, it literally altered my entire understanding of the issue. So let's jump right in. So here's the big question we're tackling. Why do women still participate in politics less than men? I mean, we've seen decades of progress, right? Women have secured voting rights. Parity laws have been passed. Institutional gender quotas are a thing in so many regions now. But despite all these massive formal legal reforms, this huge gap in political participation just stubbornly refuses to go away. To put the stakes of this mystery into perspective, just think about the number 16. As of January 2025, women serve as heads of government in only 16 countries globally. And worldwide, they hold just about 27% of parliamentary seats. Even in places like Latin America, which actually pioneered a lot of parity laws, the numbers are still falling way short of true equality. The door is legally wide open, so why on earth is it still so hard to get inside? Well, historically, scholars have pointed to what we can call the usual suspects. Things like voter sexism, that cultural bias that always seems to associate leadership and toughness with men. We've got the resource gap, since women historically have had less income and free time to dedicate to campaigning. And of course, there are those classic male-dominated recruitment networks, where the party gatekeepers just naturally favor candidates who look and act exactly like them. Now, are these factors real? Oh, absolutely. But do they explain the whole gap? Actually, no, not even close. Because honestly, those usual suspects only tell half the story. Even where researchers control for things like education, wealth, and basic political interests, a massive gender gap still remains. The huge economic empowerment of women after World War II didn't lead to some perfectly mirrored rise in political representation. So to find the real barrier, we actually have to look past the formal rules. We have to look under the hood and investigate the hidden, informal mechanics of political organizations. And this brings us to a major paradigm shift. The researchers introduced this brilliant concept called the corrupt gate. Think of it as this informal gatekeeping mechanism that basically acts like an invisible bouncer at the door of politics. It selects political actors not based on their ambition or their education or even their competence. No, it selects them based on their willingness and their ability to engage in illicit, rule-bending transactions. Because in a lot of political contexts, the formal rules are just a suggestion, right? They coexist with these unwritten rules. To get into those political networks, you need to know how to grease the wheels through favors, under-the-table payments, and informal negotiations. When we look at the hard numbers, things get really clear. The researchers pulled from the massive Americas Barometer survey between 2004 and 2023, ran a regression analysis, and found something striking. Holding all other things constant, meaning wealth, education, even a person's raw interest in politics, women participate in political organizations 20 to 25% less than men. Imagine carrying a 25% penalty just because of your gender, regardless of how rich or educated or highly motivated you might be. But here is the real jaw-dropper. How do the researchers explain that gap? Well, they looked at exposure to everyday corruption, specifically whether someone had participated in a bribe exchange with a police officer or a public official. And the data showed that women are 56% less likely than men to be exposed to these corrupt exchanges. Think about those everyday moments, paying off a traffic cop to get out of a ticket, or maybe slipping some cash to a clerk to speed up a building permit. Men are almost twice as likely to encounter this in their day-to-day lives. So what does this all mean? It boils down to this crucial connection. Less exposure to the unwritten rules equals less access to the political machine. Because men are exposed to everyday corruption so much more frequently, they get a lot more practice navigating those informal, rule-bending exchanges. They develop the tacit knowledge and, frankly, the tolerance required to operate in dirty environments. Women, on the other hand, have limited exposure to those everyday corrupt exchanges, which means they get fewer opportunities to pick up those specific, informal survival skills. They literally lack the necessary grease to slip through that corrupt gate. And we aren't just talking about how often this happens. We're talking about the nature of it. The corrupt gate is fundamentally unbalanced. For men, being socialized into rule-bending often starts really young. Minor infractions, negotiating a bribe for driving without a license. It normalizes financial bribes and trading favors. But for women, the corrupt gate looks completely different. It rarely just involves cash. It frequently involves an abuse of power that comes with impossibly high social, personal, and emotional costs. Which brings us to a deeply disturbing but absolutely vital part of this research: sextortion. This is exactly what it sounds like: the abuse of power to obtain sexual favors. In political and bureaucratic hierarchies, advancement or even just basic access to opportunities is sometimes explicitly or implicitly conditioned on tolerating sexual harassment or abuse. This is a very distinct form of corruption that fuses sexual exploitation right into the abuse of authority. When you look at the true cost of entry, the reality for women becomes horrifyingly steep. Navigating these corrupt political environments doesn't just mean throwing a few extra dollars to pay off a gatekeeper. It forces women into situations where they must tolerate abuse. It demands this extreme psychological endurance and often strategic silence. It forces an impossible lose-lose choice between a woman's own dignity and her political survival. Because these unwritten rules are so highly gendered and sexualized, the system is fundamentally, structurally designed to filter women out. So this totally reframes how we look at policy. It forces us to ask a pretty profound question. Is anti-corruption just about saving taxpayer money? I mean, traditionally, we think of fighting corruption as a way to make sure public funds actually build roads instead of just lining some politicians' pockets, right? We think of it purely as a matter of economic efficiency. But this research forces us to view anti-corruption through an entirely different lens. If we actually want to bring women into politics, we've got to dismantle the corrupt gate. And how do we do that? By bringing in institutional designs that strip away that backroom discretion. We're talking about implementing open primaries, or hey, maybe even selecting candidates by lottery in some cases. It means strictly enforcing a merit-based civil service and instituting really robust external oversight and public reporting. The whole goal is to replace that informal, dirty grease with formal, transparent procedures. Because when you limit the power of those gatekeepers to demand informal favors, you inherently make the pathway into politics safer and way fairer for everyone. There's a quote from the study that just hits the nail on the head, and it completely redefines how we should be looking at gender politics. They write, "Anti-corruption policy is a means of dismantling the informal codes that sustain unequal access to political power." Think about that for a second. Fighting corruption isn't just some dry administrative task. It is a vital feminist initiative. It's a literal prerequisite for achieving gender equality in the public sphere. So the big takeaway of this explainer is this: empowering women isn't simply about slapping a numerical quota on a ballot, as important as those quotas might be. If the metaphorical cigar room doors are still locked tight by unwritten, corrupt codes, a quota is not going to necessarily put women in positions of real power. Fighting corruption is what actually breaks the hidden networks of male dominance. It destroys the invisible barrier. I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. Can we ever achieve true gender equality without first breaking the unwritten rules of politics? As long as political access relies on these opaque, discretionary, and frankly abusive informal exchanges, the scales are always going to remain unbalanced. True equality requires dragging those unwritten rules out into the light and demanding a political system that relies on transparency, not on who you know or what you're willing to endure just to get in the room. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you, and I'll catch you next time.